FMEA, or Failure Mode and Effects Analysis. We are going to use FMEA in two different phases of the DMAIC process, typically. In the measure phase, we are concerned with using FMEA to identify and document existing failure modes and make sure that our new improvements address those failure modes. Then we will come back and use FMEA in the control phase to try to document any failure modes that we anticipate could happen, and to give the process owners a list of corrective actions or responses to those different failure modes that we predict might happen in the future. So let's take a look at what FMEA is trying to do. With FMEA, we have three different items that we are going to try to estimate for each different failure mode. One is going to be the occurrence. So what is the likelihood that a particular failure mode might occur? And we're going to score that from 1 to 9. And then the second thing that we might look at would be the ability for us to detect when that failure mode has happened, also scoring 1 to 9. And then finally, the severity. So if that failure mode happens, how severe is the outcome? Again, 1 to 9. So in the measure phase, we're going to look at and brainstorm as many different failure modes as we can find and try to identify all these failure modes. And then we identify the probability of occurrence. So if it's a high likelihood of occurrence, then it's going to get a 9. If it's a low likelihood of occurrence, it's going to get a 1. If we have a low ability to detect that it's going to happen, meaning when it happens, we can't see that it happened, right? So this is cannot see, or low ability to detect. That's going to get rated actually as a 9. That's a dangerous thing when we can't detect when something happens. If we have a high probability of detecting it, then it's going to get rated as a number 1. Severity, that should be pretty straightforward. If it is a low impact, then we give it a 1. If it's a highly severe impact, then we give it a 9. Now we just take these three numbers and we multiply them together. So we might have something like a 3 for occurrence, multiplied times a 5 for detection, and multiply that times let's say a 2 for severity. So 3 times 5, 15, times 2 gives us a score of 30. We're going to do that simple calculation based on the occurrence, detection, and severity for all of our different failure modes and come up with our score. And that FMEA score is then going to be ranked, each failure mode against each other. And whichever have the highest scores, that's going to be where we focus our attention first. Something might have a high score because it has a high degree of occurrence, it happens a lot, or it is something that is difficult for us to detect. Therefore, we want to definitely fix that problem since we can't detect the problem when it does happen, or has a high severity. So 9s in any of those categories would be a danger sign, and those would be the items that we want to focus on first and make sure we get fixed. So in the measure phase, we're documenting existing failure modes that we've been able to identify, and we put these occurrence, detection, and severity measures against them. When we get to the control phase, we will hopefully have solved all of the high FMEA issues that we found in the measure phase as part of our improvements. Now, when we get into the control phase, we have a bit of a different problem. In the control phase, there are going to be failure modes that we know could happen in the future. Perhaps it's a machine that goes down, or an employee that doesn't come to work, or a raw material that doesn't arrive. So we have different types of failure modes that we might be able to anticipate could happen in the future. Well, we want to go ahead and do the same type of analysis of the occurrence, the likelihood of detecting, and the severity of all those future failure modes. And so we might call that FFMEA, future failure mode analysis. And for those future failure modes, we do our calculations here, figure out their score. But then here's a difference. While in the measure phase, we use those scores to rank and focus our improvement efforts. Here in the control phase, we're going to use those scores, and those scores are going to allow us or guide us to make sure that we write and document processes for corrective actions. So when a particular failure mode occurs, and this is now we've finished our time with the process, we've handed the process ownership back to the process owner, and process is running along. Now, one of these future failure modes occurs, and we want the process owner to come to this FMEA and take a look at the FMEA, find that particular failure mode, and then read this process for corrective action. So how should the process owner respond to that particular failure mode? So we want to do this so that in the future, when there is some sort of failure, and the process that we put into place as part of our improvement is shaken by that failure, we want to make sure that the process has a specific response and that the process owner is guided in that response. If we don't do that, then we will leave the process and the process owner to figure out how to respond on their own. And it's at that point that most processes begin to fall back into their old patterns, and the improvements we've put in place tend to start to fall away, and the process returns to its original state. That happens when the process faces these special cause variations, these failures that the process owner then doesn't know how to respond to and has to come up with something. And so that's what we're trying to control for in the control phase using the FMEA, is to look at all these future failure modes, put a corrective action process in place so that the people in the process don't ad hoc make up solutions when those problems occur. A good example of this is to think about commercial pilots. A commercial pilot flying a jet up in the air, and there's some sort of problem, and so a failure mode. Now, we as traveling passengers really want to make sure that there's already a documented procedure for how to deal with that failure, rather than having each pilot independently come up with a different solution on how to respond to that failure. And so the airlines do have documented procedures for responding to pretty much every anticipated failure mode that they could think of in that jetliner. And so, say an engine goes out, it's not up to the pilot and the co-pilot to decide what to do then. It's up to the pilot and co-pilot to open up the book, which is essentially the FMEA, and say, when this failure mode occurs, what is my corrective action process or plan? And so that's what we want to do for our processes as well, is have this FMEA in the control phase with the corrective actions associated with each of these different failures that we can reasonably forecast and think may happen in the future.